Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Stone.
And I'm Eileen Rafferty.
And welcome to our conversation on creativity as part of our video series on the creative process.
For this conversation in the season of winter, we thought that we would talk about how to stay motivated with your work and how to stay motivated in the creative cycle when it's not always easy to.
It's snowing outside and it's in the teens, and even though we're hardy Montana women, sometimes it's difficult to get out there with your camera, or you might not be inspired by what's happening outside. And so we wanted to pass on some ideas for you to stay inspired and motivated in seasons or times where the creative process isn't going super well.
We've all been there, and it's a part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing you can ever avoid. It happens to everyone. So we thought we could give you some pointers on ways that we work through those hard times and keep staying motivated.
Yeah, and I would say one of the things that I have noticed is that whatever I'm reading definitely can directly or indirectly relate to or influence the photographs that I'm making or the art that I'm making. And I'm not surprised by that, but sometimes you can intentionally read outside your norm to stimulate areas of your brain and the creative process to give you newer ideas for your photography.
And it's good to find out what your inspiring places are, because then when you are feeling like you're struggling, you can go to that place and hopefully find inspiration. So for me, going to a library or going to a bookstore is a sort of knee-jerk response. It's one of those things I do when I'm feeling a little stifled in my creativity.
And the other thing that Eileen taught me many years ago was to look outside photography and find out how we can be inspired by, writing poetry, or even, painting, or people who draw, or people who sculpt, or performance art. Sometimes when I'm looking at a painting and I see combinations of colors that I wouldn't have considered before, that can throw you into a whole new realm with your photography.
The idea is that you just really never know where or when you're going to be inspired, but I do think it's up to us to get those channels open and flowing. So Elizabeth, tell us about the story that you had in your residency.
Yeah, I was in Wyoming a few years ago at an artist in residence, and it was wintertime, and I was outside and I was actually photographing animal tracks in the snow and then the grass. And at the same time, I just brought a book with me to read. Really didn't know that much about the author. It was called The Tiger by John Vaillant, and it was about Siberian tigers, and a little bit about the history of the region. And I came across a passage in the book about 75% of the way through, and it talked about humans tracking animals for survival, for food, and how those tracks became a source of language or proto-alphabet for the hunters. And it was just so interesting to me that at the time I was actually making photographs about animal tracks.
So Elizabeth, just to be clear, you were making these photographs and reading this book at the same time, but you didn't have any awareness that you were actually reading about the same thing you were making the images about.
Yeah.
So, that's a really good example of not ever really knowing when that web is going to form, and also having trust in the creative process and having trust in your intuition that you grabbed that book and you were enjoying it, and that you were making these images and you were enjoying them, but you had no idea why you were making the images. You had no idea it was going to become a body of work, and you didn't know that there was going to be this year of work coming out of it.
Right. Yeah. Do you want to share with people, Eileen, how you came into one of your favorite photographs that still resonates with you a few years ago?
Sure. I think it's a great example of this trusting the process, and also not always feeling highly motivated or excited about what we're doing when we're feeling a little lost. Those are sometimes the best times to stumble upon something, even though it might not feel so great to not know what we're doing. That's also a time when things can be limitless. And so this was quite a few winters ago, another cold, harsh winter in Missoula. I was going through some difficult times in life, and I had a good friend who convinced me to go out and shoot, and I didn't feel like shooting, and I decided to go anyway. So I accepted the invitation and went, and I was randomly grabbing props for the shoot, having no plan and no idea what I was going to do, and I happened to grab a fresh little green fern that I had just bought. For about an hour I did self-portraits, because that's what I do when I often don't know what to do, and I wasn't excited about any of them, and they were okay, but I just kept shooting and kept doing it. And then eventually I brought out the plant as a prop and I started thinking about where I was in my head and looking at this plant and looking at the landscape, and I decided to make an image as if I was planting this fresh green little fragile fern in this barren white snowy landscape. And for me it was a moment of hope, or this seed of growth and possibility in an otherwise cold landscape. And it has become one of my favorite images and still has a lot of meaning to me today.
It also speaks to the creative process, right? That things are going to change if you just stay in it. You can trust that there will be movement as long as you keep in the creative process, that things are going to shift one way or the other.
Absolutely. And I think that brings up another point that we were talking about earlier is I think it's always good to push ourselves creatively and come up with new ideas or new ways of working, or certainly we've both experimented with new materials. But sometimes doing something new can be frustrating because we don't know it yet and it's hard and we're learning it. And I've definitely had experiences where I'm working with something new that it becomes so frustrating that it's inhibiting my progress. And so I think in times like that, it's a good idea to go back to what's familiar, whether that be going out and simply shooting in the way you used to shoot, or working with a material that you've worked with forever, working with a lens that you know.
Yeah, and I think the way I think about it, I think of someone who's like a concert pianist. They still have to do their scales every day, right? So they're constantly practicing. So I think going back to something familiar can be really helpful just to get things moving. And that's what we're searching for, is movement in the creative process.
True. Also, that something familiar is not giving up on the new process. Because if we always tried something new, got frustrated and went back to the old, we would never do anything new.
Right.
It's just a means to keep the process going.
Agreed. So just to wrap it up, we have 3 ways to help people stay motivated in the wintertime or when things are slow in the creative process. And one would be to seek out new ways of getting inspired. Go to your library, get a book, see different films, get out of your comfort zone. A second way would be to just push through and get out there and hit the shutter button. Usually going through the motions gets movement going and momentum going.
Yeah, and the third one would be if you're working with new ideas or new materials and you're becoming frustrated, instead of stopping the process altogether, go back to something that's familiar and do what you already know how to do. At least you'll keep the gears turning rather than putting a halt to the entire process.
So thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you in the spring.
Thanks.